for 9 years.
For death by PowerPoint. I want to thank Dennis for the offer and invitation to come and speak with you today. You'll find my remarks to be a lot more general and less focused specifically on Calgary than either David's. What perhaps are some of the global best practices in dealing with flood hazards and flood hazard mitigation? And then also begin to compare it to things that are actually happening here in the province and things that are happening at institutions like Alberta's universities. And just to get a couple names off before I forget them, Larry Bentley at U of C and Masaki Hayashi, also at U of C, are both currently doing some research around groundwater surface water interaction in this basin. So those projects, I think, started just earlier this year. What I wanted to begin my comments with is, in most of my career, I've worked very close to agriculture, and I've really come to know somewhat intimately that floods and droughts are just different sides of the same coin. And I think from looking at the hydrographs that both Dave and Professor Osborne have shown, you can see that we live in an area where flows and water availability is highly variable. And so where now we are talking about a very significant flood event, if we were back in 2001, we would be talking about a very significant drought event, all in the same basin, but with different people impacted, depending on where they live. I was also taking a look at a report that was produced recently in the Netherlands, and I think it also adds some context to what we've been talking about here, and so I'd just like to share you that quote. "It may never be possible to prevent flooding entirely, but people can largely determine for themselves to what extent they want to control the risk." One, I think from an emergency response point of view, in dealing with what's actually happened, we come up really good. In taking a look at what has happened in the EU recently with some flooding, comparing to floods in the United States, I think our emergency response to the event has actually been quite good and quite commendable. What I have found, though, is that there seems appetite in many parts of society for knowing more about what is possible, for having a better understanding of what the big picture might be. So, taking a look at some of those things, it is now possible today, in the world that we live in, to map floods before they ever happen. And to map them with a very high level of certainty and with an opportunity to begin to really do a lot of what-ifs around these kinds of things. So what if this flow is only half of a flow we might see in the future? How do we begin to understand those and then visualize them so that we can see what the potential impacts might be, and then be able to decide, are these risks we want to mitigate, or are these risks that, because of whether it's the frequency or whatever, that we're willing to live with? So in much of the United States, in programs run by the U.S. Geological Survey, the USGS, as well as in large part the Federal Emergency Management Organization or agency in the U.S., FEMA, most of the new work being done on flood mitigation planning is being done with the use of LiDAR technologies to produce very, very accurate maps of where flooding could take place. These technologies are then being married up with a whole host of models. Professor Osborne talked about some. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has a broad suite of models that are available really to anybody who wants to use them. There are other models that have been developed by engineering consulting firms, but there is an opportunity now to begin to marry all of these things together so that you can take a look at what the potential impacts of any particular flood might be. Once you get to that point, that also gives you then the opportunity to start to talk about other things that are extremely important. not only what is the critical infrastructure within a potential flooded area, and where is it, how potentially at risk is it, but we can actually start to look at even human infrastructure. We can look at locations of hospitals, clinics, police stations, all of these types of things to get a better picture of if something occurs, what are the things we can do. In the state of Washington in 2009, in a coastal river called the Snoqualmie, there was a very, very large flood. What was interesting is they responded fairly well. There was significant damage. I don't recall if there was any loss of life. But what they did after that is they went in and began to kind of reverse engineer the flood, doing all of this kind of study work, using the most up-to-date technologies and models to assist decision makers in understanding what happened. And what we actually found now is that we have the technologies available to us, where not only can you map the flood area, but you can take a look at how long it takes water to rise to a certain elevation, how far it goes out, how quickly it recedes, and you can have a much better understanding of the dynamics of floods at various frequencies and levels. Alberta is not completely out of the picture in this, in that we do have some of the world's leading LiDAR experts who are actually at universities in this province. And I think have a lot that they could contribute to what we would want to do going forward. That said, if this knowledge and experience just stays in our institutions and is shared with students and amongst us who like to talk about it, it really doesn't help anybody else. So I think part of the other challenge we have when we look at these issues, and I think this flood is a really good opportunity to see what has happened, is the sun came out, we had the rest of the summer, a lot of people who weren't impacted have gone about their lives, but the conversation is continuing. This has been a very big thing, and I live in Lethbridge. The Old Man River also flooded. It was only half of 2005, but I live way up on the top, and the Old Man River is way down here. And I actually, living in Lethbridge, I don't get that excited about floods. It's going to have to come up an awful long way. But I'm a taxpayer. And my view is that whether the province or the feds are going to, at the end of the day, be able to cover all of these costs in the short interim, we're all in this together, financially and otherwise. So I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking a little bit about a word that David Atkinson has used, so that the rest of you know, and it probably doesn't matter to any of you, but we've known each other for almost the whole time David's been in Canada, and it's been a number of years since we saw each other, so this is a good event to get us together. If we talk about resilience, there's a number of pieces to this. There's built infrastructure resilience. How well will these bridges and roads stand up to an event? There's also some resilience around natural infrastructure. And this has already been mentioned. What's happening upstream of Calgary? How are the wetlands? How are the forests? How much impervious surfaces are we creating, which really does drive water to the river quickly? There's a number of pieces around social resilience. We have a professor on our faculty in Lethbridge, Judith Kulig, and Alana, you might remember her name. She did some really interesting work in taking a look at community resilience in Slave Lake right after the wildfire a couple of years ago. I think what we've found in our discussions is that as much as we need to be planning for the events that could take place, we also need to be talking about how we plan for the social resilience. How do we equip people in communities so that they can make the best decisions that will give the best outcomes for the people who live in their communities? Also, how do we respond after it so that we can take care of other issues that could come up? Whether they're mental health issues, whether they're healthcare issues, increases in addictions or gambling, all kinds of things that can come about as part of the stress or result of the stress that people find themselves under. And how many large high-rises were unoccupied for long periods of time. And I'm thinking about business resilience and how we're able to ensure that we don't lose the opportunity to continue to conduct our lives through these kinds of interruptions, are the things we can be doing there. There's a big piece around environmental resilience, and we've also heard about communication and communication resilience. What is not really ironic, but interesting, is from June 3rd to June 6th this year, at the same time these events were happening in Calgary, let me find the name because I got to remember the name good. There was a National Hydrologic Warning Council was holding its annual meetings in Florida. Over 4 days, they had well over 100 presentations, all of which are to one degree or another applicable to what we might decide to do in Alberta on a go-forward basis. What was really interesting in looking at those presentations, and I didn't go there, but the presentations are all online, so you can go look at them, is a recognition that we are in this together, we suffer together, we'll respond together, and we can only plan for this by working together. There is no single government agency or any other group that is going to help us accomplish what we might want to have on a go-forward basis unless we're all working together. In water, that's sometimes a really interesting thing to try and do, is to have people actually work together. And I think in this province we have seen some good successes, and I'll relate one of those in a couple minutes. But I think if we take a look at a group of words, these might guide the choices we make. Collaboration. People have to learn to work together and to actually collaborate. I used to wonder what that meant, and then as I've gotten older, I've remembered some things my mother told me when I was young. One is, Dave, a conversation is not waiting for your turn to talk. Collaboration is as much about listening and understanding as it is anything else. Cooperation. If we can collaborate, then we also have to learn to cooperate. And people with very diverse views on the same thing can actually do this. We can be motivated to do this. Integration. So, whatever the city of Calgary does, as a result of its plans, will definitely have an effect on the city of Calgary, but it'll also have an effect on everybody downstream. So, integration, taking a look at this as a systems problem, taking a look at the entire Bow River Basin and its tributaries becomes very important. The one piece that is really difficult in all of this, because it usually gets into money, is implementation. So when we've got the collaboration and the cooperation, we're moving to the integration, we have to implement. And that implementation is sometimes what we do not get to. And the reason we don't get to it, many cases, is because it stops raining. Or in the case of a drought, it starts raining. So the implementation piece becomes very important. If we manage to bring these things together in an open and transparent way, we'll kick off another word that's going to be important going forward, and that's innovation. And that's not just new widgets. That's new ways of doing things and behaving that achieve very specific outcomes. While we're talking about a flood today, over the last 2 or 3 years, there's been a group of very dedicated individuals talking about drought. And that's been happening in the Bow River Basin. It was a project funded by Alberta Innovates Energy and Environment Solutions, which is one of the province's Innovates corporations. And it was taking a look at, is it actually possible to manage the entire Bow as a single unit, as a single system? And that work's been carried out by Alberta Innovates, as well as a Calgary-based company, Alberta WaterSmart, bringing in some very good talent from the United States, a company called Hydrologics. What we found in that group is, though, even though people might have been believed to disagree diametrically with each other. When we looked at the entire system, you can make decisions at a system level that better meet people's individual needs while addressing a whole bunch of other public needs. And I think that similar approach is probably where we're going to need to move to as we talk about how we go forward in flood planning for this province, depending on the community that we live in. In June of this year, I happened to be in the Netherlands. I was at the University of Utrecht. And we took a day with some folks from Deltaris and Delft and went and looked at some of their new flood emergency warning systems and their activities. I guess the Netherlands, in some respect, is kind of like Medicine Hat. It's at the bottom of everything. So anything that happens in water in this province, in the South Saskatchewan Basin, is going to end up in Medicine Hat. It's no different in the Netherlands. They have the same problems that we do, in that they may be subject to floods that they have very little control over, yet they have to manage them. And so they've now developed, through a very open and public process, ways of diverting water out of rivers, across farmland in some cases, and in many cases, to prevent that water from ever running into a city. And in other cases, they're building cities that basically float. I don't think we're in that situation here in the province, but I think there are a multitude of opportunities we have that we can look at. So just to finalize and not run on, recently I've learned some new language. In this conference that took place in Florida, there was an awful lot of talk about nowcasting. Not just forecasting, but nowcasting. And this is really taking a look at how much better information might you need in the midst of an event to make the best decision right now. Having a lot of, I think the other language is situational intelligence. But the nowcasting was taking a look at how much data are you getting about the rain that's falling, but bringing in Doppler radar at the same time on portable units to find out where the intensity pockets are. Because if you just rely on what's happening in the rain gauges, you may not be getting a complete picture. So I think we have an opportunity now in Alberta, based on the experiences we've had, to bring in some of the best technologies and approaches and really see if we can't, as communities, build a very resilient and positive response to the future events that are likely to occur and likely will occur. But we may be able to manage them in a way that's very different than what we've seen in the past, because we may be aware of more options to deal with them. So there are roles for academics and universities. I know at our university, we have folks that are very well engaged in the hydrology. We've actually been doing some work, and also, David, so that you know, one of these projects on the bow has actually taken a look at the changes to stream flow from climate change. And we have ensemble forecasts going forward. We should just share those with the city so you've got those. That kind of information is now much more readily available. We were working with Dr. Dave Sachin at the University of Regina. John Pomeroy, who has been mentioned here today, has done some wonderful work at developing models for ungauged streams. So if you don't have any gauges on those streams in the mountains, that doesn't mean you're not without some information about what could happen. And so I think we do have this opportunity of bringing people together. There's definitely roles for governments, federal government, provincial government, and civic governments like Calgary. The role of the federal government in Canada related to floods is very different than it is in the United States. Even though in the US, the primary response is at the state and civic level, the federal government has a number of programs, FEMA, the National Flood Insurance Program, they have the National Weather Service, they have the US Geological Survey, they have a number of things in their kind of toolkit that we don't have countrywide in the same way, although we have much of the data in Alberta. There's a role for corporations. This is one of the things I think is interesting to look forward to in how we might move forward in Alberta, in that there were a number of very large corporations in downtown Calgary who were really impacted by this flood, who whose people could not go to work. I would imagine that costs them money. Recently, in the last number of years, a group of corporate CEOs got together in the Minneapolis and St. Paul area. And they created a group called Itasca. I think it has some local significant name. But what they did is they convened state government, civic government, other business leaders, academics, and others to tackle persistent problems in that Minneapolis-St. Paul area. One of them was not floods, but it had to do with transportation networks. Another one had to do with public school education. I think we're leaving some people very untapped. I think a lot of people in corporations have a lot to offer if they know the way to give and if they know the way to share. So perhaps maybe to sum up, I would like you to remember that kind of language around collaboration, cooperation, integration, implementation, and then the innovation that will come out of that. You will be surprised, and I hope we are all pleasantly surprised, at the kinds of ideas that can be generated from citizens and from people who are given an opportunity to participate in a meaningful process and make their views known. One of the difficulties in that task is defining the outcomes you're trying to achieve. So I don't think we can prevent floods. But what we can do is give ourselves a set of pretty discrete objectives about what we want to have happen to public property, to public safety, to a lot of these infrastructure pieces, and then build ourselves going forward with a better idea of maybe how we're going to get there. I doubt that this is cheap, but my expectation is it's less than paying for the damages on that recurrent basis, no matter how quickly or how infrequently or frequently they come about. And I think from a provincial perspective, we're in very good shape in this province. I know at our university, I know a number of people at the U of C and U of A as well, to bring to bear a lot of very good talent to address these issues, and to also make sure that we're training that next cadre of people we will need in this province to ensure we can continue to make progress as time goes on. Thank you very much.
Communities, and also help bring together the voice of the community to government at various levels. So after we formed our little groups, we decided that there were, we wanted to get together a group to look at sort of what the prevention elements were. And then we wanted to get together a group to look at policy. And then we also wanted to explore things around the idea of flood insurance. So in terms of the prevention part of our organization, Charles Hansen is here today. I see Charles. We've had a number of people who have a great deal of expertise in engineering and hydrology and planning in our watershed send us a lot of information. And we were sort of sifting through it all, trying to figure out what to do with this information. And then we got teed up with Alan Markin and the Flood Advisory Panel. So Premier Alison Redford appointed Alan Markin and Tino, I can't remember Tino's last name, D'Amato. Yeah, and I think Russ McKenzie of Stantec has been working with him on that. And they ended up, we just felt like they were making quite a great deal of progress and moving really quickly. So what we did was we streamed all of sort of the community voice and information and expertise that were coming to us over to Alan's group. And I think a lot of that got incorporated into sort of some of the stuff that they're doing right now. I also want to report that on September 10th, the executive group of our committee got to meet with Alan and his team. And we got a preview of some of the plans and proposals that they have in place. Now, we pressured for this because we thought it was really important that some of this information start getting out there. Naturally, nothing has been committed to necessarily on a provincial level yet or on a city level. What we do know is that we think they're making really great progress. We think there's quite a bit of innovative thought going into some of the things that they're looking at in terms of what you can do for the high wood, for the elbow, for the bow, whether it's upstream or downstream stress. so the sooner we have a little bit of clarity around maybe possible directions, that's a great thing. So that's how we, so we're hoping that they continue to do, that panel continues to do great work, and that, things start to come out of that. So, and we plan on definitely holding our government accountable on that, in that regard. We also want to say, this is a multifaceted problem, and it is very Bold, who is he's the Southern Alberta Recovery Task Force. He's the guy in charge of that. He's a former Brigadier General. He's been actually very helpful to deal with. So when the DRP first came out, there were a whole lot of rules around mitigation, requirements